Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate this Thank You Next set inspired by the one and only Ariana Grande's song. First up would be the sugared lips. You can see that I'm using a bottle here to pipe instead of the tipless bags that I typically use now. This is just what I used to use and what I preferred. It's something that I recommend actually for beginners if you don't have much control over a piping bag. I find that there's just more control when you're using bottles. Of course, though, you have to use tips like I'm using here. This tip just came with the bottle. So this is actually flood consistency. I'm doing a 1 consistency outline and flood here, and it's a flood that's on the thicker side. Now I'm going to be putting sprinkles on top of this, and it's really easy when you're covering an entire surface with sprinkles for it to fall over the edge, and you really don't want it to do that. I actually let this icing dry for maybe a minute just so that it's not quite as wet, and I do that as a way to kind of help the icing stabilize a little bit more, and kind of help prevent the sprinkles from really sinking in too much to the icing and pushing it around too much. Another thing that you can do is to not totally flood all the way to the edge. You can see I'm leaving just a tiny bit of space, like a millimeter, which is more than I typically use. And you also want to make sure that you're not over flooding. And I think it's important when putting sprinkles on like this that you sprinkle them on, and as opposed to, say, pressing them on if you were to press the cookie into the sprinkles. That's why I like to do sprinkles over a bowl like I do here. The scribe that I was doing there honestly wasn't really necessary since I'm just putting sprinkles on top. I'm using a much bigger sanding sugar than I typically do because I really wanted that texture. If I had used a smaller sanding sugar, then it really would have just sunk into the icing, and it wouldn't have had quite as much pizzazz as I think this does. So that's the sugared lips. And up next, we have this kind of 3-dimensional zigzag lip, which is actually probably my favorite one from this set. And the first thing I'm doing is just outlining and flooding. And again, I'm using a 1 consistency outline and flood just for ease. And I didn't really see it necessary for any reason to do 2. And you know me, if I don't need to do 2, I typically prefer to do 1. And again, this is my thicker-ish flood. If you're doing seconds, it's probably somewhere in the region of 20 seconds. I personally don't use the second method anymore, but I certainly did when I was first beginning. Now, you may also see here I'm actually using a tipless bag. So why did I use bottles for the other colors? That's a great question that I don't really know the answer to. It was just what I was feeling that day, I guess. You also have to have quite an arsenal of bottles on hand if you prefer to use bottles, because they can get used up quite quickly. Now I let that white surface crust over, and now I'm doing this zigzag with a medium-ish peak piping consistency. I had done a few of these lips before I did this one, which is why I'm able to kind of eye this shape. Now, if you're uncomfortable freehanding like I'm doing here, you could certainly take an edible marker and mark out the shape of the lips, because believe me, when I was doing this, I probably wasn't breathing because I was so nervous about making sure that I got the shape just right. What I'm doing here is I'm applying consistent pressure on the bag and just doing a zigzag motion back and forth, making sure that I'm touching each line to each other, as opposed to, say, giving separation in between the lines. So that is the zigzag lip, my favorite. And then last but not least for the lips is the more classic red lip with a little wet on wet dimension, and I flooded this in sections. What that means is I am flooding alternate sections. I'm allowing them to crust and then flooding the section next to it. Usually this is done when you're doing, say, one color and you want definition in between the sections of the colors. If I had just flooded this entire thing, or say flooded these sections one after the other without allowing them to crust, they would just melt into each other, and then it would just look like this one big red blob, which is an option too. But I wanted there to be definition in between the sections. And again, this shape that I have drawn here, if you're uncomfortable freehanding it, just use an edible marker. I have them linked in my Amazon shop. Super easy. Here I'm using white flood consistency and a scribe to just do a little highlight on the lips. And I allow this to crust over. In a dehydrator, it's about 15 minutes. If you're leaving it out in front of a fan, more like 30-ish. You want the surface to be dry to the touch, but if you put pressure on it, it would certainly sink in. So that's what I mean when you want it to crust. It's just the top layer that needs to dry so that when you pipe something wet next to it, that there will be definition. And you can see this here. You can see that line in between the sections, and that's exactly what I'm going for. This is how I prefer to flood section to section. Some people will actually do more like an outline pipe, like I did as I was outlining the bottom of the lip, as opposed to just immediately flooding next to the dry section. Just a word to the wise, if you need to use a scribe when flooding in sections, you do not want to get your scribe closer than a couple millimeters away from the dry section, because if you get too close to the dry section, you're going to really mess up that beautiful line that you've created in the first place. So just keep that in mind if you're someone that prefers to use a scribe. I was just poking an air bubble right there with my scribe, giving this a little jiggle because the flood is on the thick side. And those are the classic lips. Up next we have, I should say last up, would be the Thank You Next plaque. This is the Nancy plaque from Kaleidocuts, one of my all-time favorite cutter makers and one of my all-time favorite shapes that she's made. This is hugely popular in the cookie world, this Nancy plaque. It's quite versatile. So I'm doing a technique here where I am outlining the shape in a different color than I'm going to flood. I personally prefer to do this technique with actually a flood consistency as the outline. I find that when I do a piping consistency, unless I can cut the tip of that bag really thick, the piping consistency tends to just kind of disappear. And the point here is that this is supposed to be a design element, and I really want this red to stick out. So when I use a flood consistency, it just, it floods out. It becomes a thicker line than if I was piping, if that makes sense. And it just is more prominent than if I had piped it with a thicker consistency. It's a little hard to describe, I guess, but this is what I would recommend doing. I personally like this, and I oddly haven't really had any issues with cratering doing this outline like this with flood consistency, but I guess that's just something to keep in mind as well. And it's important when doing this technique that you allow that outline to dry and then go in with your flood consistency. Now you can see here I'm doing something a little weird where I'm flooding from left to right instead of my usual outside in. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm doing a wet on wet design that I know is going to take me a long time in that lower right corner. And my flood consistency here is a little bit thicker than I would really like it to be, but I guess I decided not to remix it, just work with it. And so I'm flooding from left to right so that the freshest icing is on the right side where I'm actually doing the wet on wet technique, so that I'm working with the wettest icing as opposed to the left side, which is at this point probably already started to crust over. I'm doing these wet on wet lips. This is first piping the outline of the lips with flood consistency. And I'm kind of doing a messy flood here because I don't want it to be fully red. I was going for kind of more of a spotty look, as if it was like an actual lipstick imprint. What's the word here? You know what I'm going for. This is a lipstick mark. Now it looks like I'm moving pretty quickly here, and I almost thought that I accidentally sped up this part of the video. I did not. This is my real time, and I'm using my scribe here and not cleaning it off in between each stroke because I want this messy look of these pulls in the icing to kind of give it that jagged look of actual texture of a lip and the kind of imperfectness of what a lipstick mark would look like. So it's a lot of just jiggling back and forth, pulling the red into the white to give it the jagged edges. And you can see that I'm really quite manipulating this shape a good amount. And wet on wet, it can actually be pretty malleable if you work with it fast enough. So if you didn't get the first shape quite right for whatever reason, you can use a scribe to adjust it, or you can even use more icing in whatever color is necessary to get the shape that you want. So I actually spend quite a lot of time messing with this, just as much as I could tell the icing was starting to crust, and I did not want that to happen. So I have allowed this white surface to dry, and you can see how beautifully that red outline is sticking out, and that's exactly what I wanted. And for this lettering, I just found a font on Word that I liked. I tried out a bunch, and I wrote out the letters that I wanted. The way that I use my projector for this is I just take a screenshot of the letters in Word and then use that as a file to project with my projector. I have linked 2 of the projectors that I have in the description of this video. Maybe there's a better way to do it, but I don't know. So here we are. And I am outlining the letters first with piping consistency. This was back in the day when I did actually use a piping tip, and if I had to guess, I would say this was a PME 1.5. PME is a bit more specialized piping tips. They're a lot longer than the Wilton tips, and they have more variance in the size of the tips. Now, I would say I think this is a bit on the thick side. Probably could have benefited from a smaller outline, but I made it work. And that's often what you just have to do with cookies. You just gotta make it work. But I'm doing the outline first. I'm allowing that to just dry as much as it takes me to just pipe this first line. And then I will go in with a flood consistency after. It can be really hard to get used to working with a projector. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what angle works best for you, because at certain angles, your hand may actually be covering the projection or the bag itself, like you can kind of see here. So it takes some getting used to. It's not a perfect science, but I find I really need, or I prefer to have a projector for lettering, because in many ways, freehanding lettering, unless you've really worked at it and you're really good at it, is just very stressful. And it's just more predictable to use a projector. I'm a big fan of a projector. If you're going to splurge on anything, splurge on a projector and a dehydrator. Those are the two things. So here I am with my flood consistency, and I'm just filling in the letters as if I was doing any other outline in flood. There is a balance to how much icing to get in here. There's such a thing as too much, and there's such a thing as too little as well. And then I'm going in with my scribe, and I want to just encourage that flood to get a little bit closer to the outline so that it gives a bit more of a seamless look. I don't normally use a scribe on lettering. I just use it when I really have to. And this time I really had to. So here, I made a boo-boo, and it looks like maybe my icing was just a little too thin or something. I could tell as I started to pipe it that it wasn't quite right. So I'm yes, it looks like the icing had separated a bit, and there was some liquid that came out instead of a fully incorporated icing. And as you know, I like to leave in these moments for the real-time tutorial so that you can see what I do to fix my mistakes. And you can see there, I actually got a tiny dot of black on that white, and I'm amazed I could get it off that easily because normally black stains so much worse than that. So I wanted to get that extra liquid out because the liquid is not going to harden like it's supposed to, because of course it's really just the liquid. It's not the fully incorporated icing that has the meringue powder, and the meringue powder is what's going to harden your icing. So I still have one more word to pipe after this, and I'm gonna leave you here and I'll be back when I'm done. So that finally is the thank you next plaque, and that is the entire set. Simple, sweet, sassy, perfect. Hope you have fun making this.